Awesome. So my name is Dan Rogers. I'm up from the Tetons. I'm a member of Teton County Search and Rescue down there. A lot of you guys have probably been down there, either at Fossil Mountain or some of the deeper caves in that area. And really based on kind of a lot of the conversation that happened at the meeting yesterday, I was pretty stoked to hear all that because it's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about anyway, right? So really, I just want to kind of go over a few quick things and just make sure, like start kind of a conversation that's, not going to end today, but hopefully go with you guys and just kind of some thought. Talk a little bit about who's responsible for cave rescues here in the West, a little bit about search and rescue teams in general, why caves are usually a bit out of the wheelhouse for those teams, and why we require and are expecting, assistance from this community, right? Also, if we have time, a few quick, heads up things to expect if you show up and interface with one of these organizations, and some things like that. So we'll jump right into it. So who is responsible for cave search and rescue operations in the Rockies? The short answer is it depends, but you can be pretty sure with very few exceptions it's different than the land management agency, right? The people that manage caves, whether that's Forest Service, BLM, Park Service, generally are not the same people that are going to perform an operation in that cave, right? Park Service is, I think, being one of the big exceptions that I know of, but there might be some more here in Montana. And generally, even then, they're probably interfacing with these teams just for extra manpower and things of that nature, right? So generally speaking, all backcountry rescue operations, kind of in the greater Intermountain West, are going to be handled by county. It's the mandate to the sheriff of that county to perform those operations, right? So that means most of the time, the agency of jurisdiction, the organization that's going to be responsible legally and physically for handling those rescues, is going to be a county search and rescue team, right? So if you remember back to the several slides that all showed the Montana counties up there's a lot of them, right? So if you're in Montana, that's what you're dealing with. If you're Wyoming, same thing, county-based, right? So a little bit about these organizations, if you're not familiar. I figured this is a good time to just kind of educate a little bit about who these folks are, right? So that when you're talking about, okay, we need to call search and rescue, we need to do whatever, what are you really getting, right? And the short answer is it depends. This is county-based, so there's going to be a wide variety of things depending on where you physically are, right? In some of the more rural counties that don't see a lot of backcountry action, that might be, a couple of deputies that like to hunt and ride their ATV around. If you come down to the Tetons, you go places in Colorado, probably Gallatin, Flathead, places here, you're going to get a large, well-funded, well-trained team specifically set up for backcountry rescue, right? So it really kind of is a big spectrum, and it's important to know, based on where you're caving, right? These teams are also almost exclusively made up of volunteers, right? So that's important to know because it's not like it's not like Europe where you have a trained, paid rescue team on staff ready to go, right? It's going to take time to spin these people up. They're working at their paint shop or they're at the office or doing whatever, right? Also, knowing that it's volunteer-based, think about how much time that spends, for training, right? Most teams will try and maintain proficiency in both general rescue skills, that's a lot of medical training, right? As well as specialty skill sets depending on where you are. For us in the Tetons and lots of places here in Montana, like Gallatin, I'm assuming is very much the same. Not only do we have to deal with caves occasionally, but we're talking about boating, we're talking about skiing, ORV, horses, snow machines, everything, right? Think about how big a county in Montana is, all the types of recreational activities that go on in it, right? We've kind of got to be familiar with all of that and able to deal with it. Since training time is limited, most of that focus on training and specialty skill sets is going to be prioritized to the types of things that you see the most, right? We'll give an example of that in a second, but think about how many cave rescues happen in the area every year. If you look at the ACA or things like that, it's not that many, right? how many ski wrecks, how many snowmobile wrecks, how many people falling off horses happen? A lot, right? So it's going to automatically be minimized in people's minds at these organizations, going forward. And that's not good or bad. It's just kind of how it is, right? So I'll give you an example of kind of my team, just because I can talk about specifics. Most of these teams are going to be similar. I think we're a little bit at the higher end of actual call-outs and time spent and training. Look at the spectrum there, right? So we have 41 operations team members, currently 2 employees, 39 volunteers, and a contract helicopter pilot currently. So I also like to point out here, that guy's standing on a stool, and it made it into the picture, so you can't unsee it now, Some numbers from last year's for us, 5,246 hours on rescues, basically double that for amount of time on training, and then community outreach, another couple hundred to 1,000, and you're looking at a lot of time, right? We had about 120-ish calls for service over that time. Not all of those are, 40 people on the ground headed out, but think about those numbers, right? That's almost 1/3 of the year. Every day for 1/3 of the year, someone called for something, right? Most of our rescues, similar to probably everyone else around here, is skiing, snowmobiling, mountain biking, ORV, boating, hiking, generally, see some lost hunters every year, things like that, right? That's kind of like the bulk and bread and butter of traditional stuff. Historically, for our team, we see about 1 cave rescue operation every 2 years on average, right? In digging through the ACA and talking to some team members that have been on in our 30-year history, that kind of roughly seemed like the numbers, right? For us, that has been exclusively in the Fossil Mountain Ice Cave, which is good and bad, right? But if you look at that, that's like 1 to 2% of total rescues, right? And again, those are quite loose numbers. Like the numbers are actually, I didn't want to dig through 30 years of files to find exact numbers, but more or less that's about it, right? 1 to 2% of total rescues is caves, and it's probably a lot less for a lot of other teams throughout the region, right? So like, if you look at those percentages alone, it's not on the forefront of a lot of teams' minds in cave rescue for decently good reason, because it's not something we see a lot, right? For us, as well as several other counties that we work with directly, Bighorn and some of the Western Wyoming or Eastern Wyoming stuff, we've been revamping our program quite a bit in the last couple years. We've brought in some trainers to the hangar to focus on SPAR and SRT techniques for the team. We've devoted trainings to this. We've started doing a lot of tabletop activities, specifically on Fossil Mountain, and trying to get up our game there. And we're not unique in any capacity there. Other teams are doing this, but I think we're thinking that we're going to see probably more, not more rescues than historically we have, but we want to approach them in a better way, in a more professional way, right? Low probability and high consequence. So this is kind of what I'm talking about when we say 1 to 2% of rescues, right? But those rescues have the potential to become really big, right? If you've ever sort of tabletopped what a cave rescue looks like, it starts eating resources almost immediately, right? Every time we tabletop the Fossil Mountain Ice Cave, if we start with a group of 18 people, that's basically one operational period that may not even do a through trip to the cave, right? Because we've got 2 entrances to deal with, we've got forward ops, we've got to get logistically all this stuff from the trailhead there, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on. So like 18 people sounds like a lot. It really isn't, even on like a non-vertical cave like that, right? And that's assuming 18 people is basically half our team, right? Who knows when this call is going to come in? Who's on vacation, who's out of town, who's like unavailable for work, right? Like 18 people would be a lot to get to show up on an hour's notice to try and start something, right? And it's very similar for every team. Also, a lot of the vertical SRT techniques are a lot different than most teams train for. Most teams, if you have mountainous environments, if you got to work on mountain passes, kind of the de facto EMS standard has been something that I like to call like the rigging for rescue standard, which is a lot of like twin tension rope systems, big gear, redundant stuff, which basically came a lot from fire and EMS because, teams like this also have to interface with those agencies, right? So like we deal with those agencies a lot more than we deal with, cave rescue folks. So like us having those same systems and being familiar with those same systems is a lot more efficient for us because we don't have to jump back and forth between small ropes and cool slick ways of doing things. It's like, okay, like we're going to go to fire and we're going to help them get this person up this slope, right? So that's like what's more or less ingrained in a lot of teams. Also it's like a lot of teams will be very proficient with patient transport, but not necessarily in a cave environment, right? You talk about, mountain bike wrecks or like ski accidents, getting people out in a toboggan, wheeled litter. Like that's bread and butter, man. Like we can do that all day. We probably do 20 of them a year. You know what I mean? Moving someone, in a PJ skid or something like that through even horizontal cave system, while we have practiced that, is not really something we see a lot, right? So we don't necessarily practice it a lot, things like that. And at some point, basically the gist here is, at some point a larger cave rescue is going to have to involve people that are cavers and have that skill set, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you guys today. And that's really where we see, organizations like this and just folks here in this community kind of fitting in. To be quite frank, it's cave rescue, at least for our team, is basically the only time our plan is to call in members that are like not part of our organization, right? Or not part of, neighboring search and rescue teams or organizations we work with, right? Like literally I was looking through the plans, and talking to people, and I don't think there is another one, right? A lot of people think, okay, big lost person search or something like that. Maybe we get the public involved. And quite honestly, like we have done that sometimes. It usually is really more of an appeasement as a way to help the public feel like they're helping. Because by the time we get people trained on proper search technique, how to run the mapping software, everything else, it's really kind of less helpful sometimes, right? This is really one of the only scenarios where you're going to see that, right? Because we're relying on people that have the skills, techniques, and knowledge that almost no one else really has, right? Especially if you've gone through NCRC stuff and been trained there, like you are very much going to be in demand if something happens in this region, right? The horizontal caves are really more within a team's wheelhouse. It's like if we're not dealing with vertical, then things are a little bit easier, right? Like we can adapt some transport techniques to tight space with, a little trial and error, right? Not too big a deal, we'll figure it out. But even then, like you start talking about transporting someone, through some of these caves, as we saw the maps on the wall, like that's gonna start eating up resources as well, right? So like you're gonna need people in there that are both comfortable in the cave environment, are used to working in confined space, and we're going to need to switch those people out quite a bit, right? Like 18 people isn't going to cut it, right? Even if we bring in people from other teams, how many of them are cavers, how many are comfortable, like, et cetera, right? Like we're really, that bell is going to ring when something gets big, right? There's also a great video on the NSS website. There's like a playlist called like Conversations in Rescue, I think, where a gentleman back east is kind of going over what that begins to look like as far as like the IC structure and organization structure, like as things start blowing up. And it's amazing to watch like how those numbers grow up, So if you're not familiar with that, we certainly recommend it. So, more to the point, basically, whether through a SAR team directly, I know like we maintain, just kind of a loose list of some local people that we would probably be our first call, just because, Driggs is far, right? The Tetons are far from a lot of things. And again, that's our cave, but think about that in the Montana structure as well, right? Like, by the time we start ringing that bell, it's still going to take a long time for anybody to get there, right? So, on that, if we do start ringing that bell and calling the, NCRC, calling the grotto, calling other grottos, looking for people that might be available to come do something like this, here are some important things kind of to know. That basically, as I alluded to, unless this is like a local cave that is near, where you live or you happen to be there, caving or just around doing anything else, it's going to take quite a while to get there, right? I think it was thrown out that how far Horse Thief even was from here, right? But think about that, right? Like that's all within this area of people are doing, right? Like it would take 5 hours to get from here in Helena to Jackson to help us, and like think about all that stuff in Glacier, right? Like prep time, drive time, everything else. What that means is by the time we've tracked down some resources, we've called it, NCRC does their thing and are tracking people down and trying to get things on the move to where this is happening, you're already going to be into operational period 2 or even 3 by the time you get there. So there's going to be a lot of things in place, right? You're going to be showing up to an active scene of an active rescue and looking to be kind of plugged into what exists, right? Also, very important to know, like there's a decent chance you don't even get there, right? We're going to start ringing that bell because we know this stuff happens, right? So like, hey, like, is anyone available to come down? You gear up, you start driving, 2 hours into it, hey, stand down. Like, things have changed, we figured out where he is, we don't need additional resources, right? Like, and I wanted to point that out specifically because I know that's something that's frustrating to people, right? But know that like, you are still being very, very helpful if that happens, right? So I just want to specifically call that out. One thing you'll definitely deal with if you come on one of these bigger rescues for any agency in here is the NIM system, the National Incident Management System. And people spend months learning this system, but all I'll really say about it is that if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially the universal system that agencies at both federal, state, local level use for emergency management, for things like fire, for things like floods, for things like search and rescue, that has like a common set of tools that people can plug into, right? So we could get a SAR team from Georgia fly up here and they would understand the system that we're running because it's the same one that they do, right? So it's just important to know that you're going to hear terms like, IC thrown around or forward ops, and you may not really understand what these are, but know that it's a greater system that a lot of everybody else does understand it, and that it's universal, right? You can expect to be, vetted at some point and given an assignment. Remember that you're going to be coming into an ongoing operation, for people that don't really know you, right? Like they know that you're an asset, you're a resource, you're coming in with a vague skill set that they probably don't really understand, right? You're going to be talking to somebody, they're going to be figuring out what your strengths and weaknesses are, where they can assign you, right? If you've ever worked for the government, you know that expect to wait around, like potentially a lot, right? Nothing moves super fast, especially not on OP2 or 3, right? Like, again, like things have already been moving, they're waiting to plug you into a place, or maybe they're waiting for, a team to get to a phone to call for something back before they have you guys deploy somewhere or whatever's going to happen, right? So just be patient. Like a lot of times people will show up and want to like go into action right away, and that's just really not how that works, right? So like just know that even if you show up and you're sitting there like, and they want you to sit there and wait till they hear something and maybe then run some equipment or some med stuff out to someone, like you are very much helping by just sitting in place, right? And just know that you'll see potentially a lot different than you're used to rigging transport techniques, because again, most of the people you're going to interface with and most of the people that are going to be operation, on OP 1 and 2 are probably not cavers, right? So like they may have like you know, a 5-to-1 haul system like set up over here with like the biggest ropes you've ever seen, right? Just know that it's going to be there and redundant and safe. And really, it's like, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. You know, just kind of as long as it's not a safety issue, just kind of roll with what you see. Obviously, make some suggestions if you can, but just know that it's like, it's probably rigged that way because the majority of the people are comfortable with it. You may not be as comfortable with it, but just try and be flexible, basically, is what I'm saying. How to be an asset, right? So this kind of goes both ways. You know, for us as a team, you know, we've actually really discussed this a lot, is, you know, when we have assets showing up, like we need to understand that they're maybe not as familiar with stuff like ICS or the, you know, the NIM system and things like that. So we need to make sure that we do things in a way and have them understand, you know, have folks understand, you know, like where they're fitting into the system, right? Like, hey, this is going to be your boss, you know, like basically listen to him, ask him any questions, you know, she is going to be running this operation, like any questions you have, direct them to them. They will give you a quick overview of what's happening, right? Try and include everyone and not assume that like there's a level of, you know, incident response that we're kind of used to with working with folks with, say, other organizations or our own, right? But when you do show up, a couple of quick ways to be an asset is really to, and this is probably the biggest one, take ownership of and be truthful regarding current readiness and skill set, right? A big one that we've kind of game planned through is like, you know, okay, so we've called for assets and people are coming, right? Like, it's a long drive. Are they going to show up to, you know, our hangar and we're going to put them right into action? Probably not. Like, you know, they probably might have been working all day and then drove 6 hours to get here, right? Like the first thing they need to do is take a nap and then wake up and be ready to be an asset, right? Like a lot of that goes around to back to like, be ready to not be put into action right away. Just not only because of a planning perspective, but also because we want to ensure that we're not putting people into the field that aren't field ready, right? So like, you've really got to take ownership of that, you know, like, and also current readiness and skill set, right? Like, we will have a job for you if you show up. That job may be rigging, that job may be, you know, sitting at entrance and manning a phone, that job may be, you know, helping IC understand the map, right? Like, regardless of where you are in your current readiness and skill set, like there will be something for you. We just want to ensure that we get you into the right place, right? You know who you report to and what they want you to do. Really, you know, like we understand that people aren't going to understand the full ICS system. Really what you need to understand is like, who am I reporting to? What do they want me to do? And what do they not want me to do? If you can figure that out, you're good to go. And part of that really is, you know, like, don't take it upon yourself to do more than that, right? Like, really a lot of these bigger operations rely on, you know, people following the rules more or less, right? It's like, go to this point and stop, right? Go to this point and stop doesn't mean, okay, let's go another 1,000 feet and check it out because we think there might be something down there. It's go to this point and stop until we tell you otherwise, right? Because there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot of things that are happening, right? So like, it's important just to, you know, regardless of what you personally think, just kind of like set that aside and be a team member that follows the gist of what's going on, right? Also, no big surprise, never compromise on team safety. That's not really a problem for folks in this room because you guys are so safety conscious. But a lot of the general public on other operations is not, let's say. Just accepting that there's many ways of doing things, and it may be getting done different than how you would ideally like, but there's probably a reason for it. That reason is probably they're not familiar with the way that's the best, so they're gonna do what they know, right? In that regard, like, you know, you will be the expert in a lot of these situations, and feel free to, you know, offer advice, offer resources if the situation warrants, but just be ready that, you know, like sometimes they're gonna take it, sometimes they're not, right? It's really like, do your best to help out, but just have a thick skin and know that like there's probably a reason if they're not gonna do it exactly how you want, right? And that is pretty much all I had. We still got about 5 minutes. So I'm curious to see, you know, what you guys think of that, or if you have any additional thoughts, you know. Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is really just a conversation, you know? It's like, know who the agency of jurisdiction is there. Give them a call. You know, like, hey, this is kind of what we're doing. You know, we're getting down here a lot. You know, is there anything you want to know? Is there anything you want us to do? And even just opening up that dialogue with the specific people that are doing it, it would be super helpful, probably. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, I'd say there's probably, you know, from our team, there's probably 5 or 6 folks that are, you know, pretty into caving. There's probably 10 to 15 folks that are decent at like SRT, have done the training, and really more like are rope professionals in other capacities, whether they're like alpine guides or things like that. So they're pretty confident on rope, not so into caves, but are like fine, if that makes sense. And the rest are passable. You know, probably enough purposes for our horizontal cave, which is, you know, Fossil Mountain, but like would never go into anything different than that, probably, if that helps answer it. All right, cool, yeah. And so also, if you ever come down to the Tetons, whether to do Fossil Mountain or some of the harder stuff, you know, feel free to give me a buzz, even if you just want to grab a beer or a shower before hitting the road or whatever. So hit me up. Thanks again.